Hi, my name is Sophia Ellis, and this is my standardized data analysis presentation. Here is a brief overview. I will first start by discussing my data analysis I evaluated for the mean and standard deviation, and then I will talk about how I use that information to evaluate for the z-scores, which helped me split students into different intervention groups. I will also discuss a special education recommendation that I have based on my data. The first thing I would like to discuss is the mean. The mean is the average of a set of numbers. At left, you can see a table which represents the midterm scores. In order to evaluate for the mean of these scores, I found the sum by adding all of the scores together, and I divided by the amount of scores, so I divided by 30. What I found is that the mean is 78.4. This means that on average, the students scored about a 78.4% on the midterm, which is about a C+. I did the exact same process for the final exam and found that the students scored on average about an 82.7%, which is a B-. What we can see here is that there is student growth between the midterm exam and the final exam. However, I did not calculate whether or not this difference is statistically significant. The next thing I evaluated was for the standard deviation. This is how far a data set is from the mean. I utilized this formula in order to evaluate for the standard deviation. I took the square root of the sum of an individual student's score minus the mean, squared that value, and then I divided it by the sample size minus 1. This process here, which shows me finding the sum of each value from the sample minus the mean squared in this work here. So as you can see, I did that for every student, so all 30 students, found those values, added them together, and got 5,229.2. After finishing this process, I received a standard deviation of 13.428. I did the exact same process for the final exam and found a standard deviation of 13.389. When comparing the standard deviations, we can see that they are really close together. I used the mean and the standard deviations in order to evaluate for the z-score. A z-score is how far an individual data score is from the mean. I'm using this information to help me split students into different groups. This is what a z-score is. So, for example, let's say that a student receives the exact same average exact same score as the average of the class. For example, the average for the midterm exam was a 78.4%. Let's say a student also received the 78.4% on their midterm exam. They would then have a z-score of 0. If a student received a score that was higher than the average, they would receive a z-score greater than 0. If they received a score that was lower than the average, then they would have a z-score less than 0. I use this information to help me split students into groups. In order to evaluate for the z-score, I followed the following formula. I took an individual student's score, subtracted the mean, and divided the standard deviation. For example, in student A here, their individual score for the midterm was 92. I subtracted the average and divided the standard deviation, and they have a z-score of 1.013, which shows that they have a score that is greater than average. I did this for all of the students. As you can see here, I also calculated the z-scores for the final exam, and I compared the z-scores from the midterm exam and the final exam as a way to group students appropriately. So what does this mean? If a student gets a z-score that is below negative 1.96, this means that they received a score that was statistically significantly lower than the class average. If their score was below 0, so they have a score below 0, but it's still greater than that negative 1.96, that means that they received a score that is less than average, but it's not statistically significant. If they receive a z-score of 0, that means that they had a score that matched the average. And if they received a score that is above 0, so it's above 0, but less than 1.96, that means that they received a score that is above the class average. And if they received a z-score that is above 1.96, that means that they received a score that was statistically significantly higher than the class average. I will not be going in depth with this for the groups. So I decided to split students into 4 different intervention groups. Level 1 is if students have a z-score that is greater than 0, so that means that they received a score that is higher than the average. Level 2 is if the student receives a score that is between negative 1.96 and 0, so that means they received a score that is less than the average, but it is not statistically significant. Level 3 also has a z-score between negative 1.96 and 0. Again, this is not statistically significant, but it does include another factor. If I see that the student shows a decline in scores from their midterm to their final, then I will place them in this group for additional interventions. Level 4 is if there was a statistically significant difference. They performed statistically significantly lower than the class average. So here's my level 1. Again, this is if they have a z-score that is greater than 0, meaning that they received a score greater than the mean. Let me give you an example. Looking at student A, we can see that they received a 92 on their midterm score. When comparing this to the midterm exam, there was a mean of 78.4. So as we can see here, they scored higher than the mean. So they received a z-score of 1.013, which is greater than 0. We can also look at their final score data. Student A received a 96 on their final score. If we compare that to the mean, which is 82.7, we can see that their final score is indeed greater than the mean. The z-score for student A is 0.993, which is indeed greater than 0, which means they fit into this level 1 group. I did some selective processes. I'm not going to go into every student, but overall I found that about 19 of the 30 students fit into this category. This is about 63.3% of the class. The intervention here is nothing. These students are on track. I believe in them. I will still keep an eye on them in case I do need to make changes and place them into a different intervention group. But right now, just keeping them in the big group class is still working fine for them. I don't need to pull them for small groups or individual interventions right now. Next is level 2. If you notice, I did block out in red the names from level 1 just so we can see the shrinkage here. But level 2 is when a student has a z-score from negative 1.96 to 0. So again, this means that they received a score that is less than the mean, but this difference is not statistically significant. For example, let's talk about student I. This student here received a midterm score of 53. We can see that this score is less than the mean itself, which was 78.4. This student received a z-score of negative 1.892, which falls in this range here. Let's look at their final score. Student I received a final score of 65. As we can see, this is lower than the final exam mean, which is 82.7. Student I received a z-score for the final exam of negative 1.32, which again falls in this range. The reason why this student falls in the level 2 category and not the level 3 category is because we do see some growth from the midterm exam to the final score. So I do believe that this is an appropriate spot for this student to be. After looking at all of the students' data, I determined that about 6 of the 30 students would benefit from this intervention level. This is about 20% of the class. In terms of the intervention, I would pull these students into small groups as a way to benefit them for the English standardized exam. I would have these students do some practice based on the skills that they need practice on. So I would look at their midterm score and their final score, and I would look at what they got wrong, and I would do some small group interventions as it applies to that. For example, if a student scored low as it applies to grammar, I would give that student some practice questions to practice applying grammar, whether it be a whiteboard activity or a Kahoot, and get some immediate feedback. When I do this in the small group, if I feel confident that the student has developed a stronger understanding, or if the student verbally tells me that they feel a little bit more confident with the content, then I would give them a classwork assignment to help show me data-wise if they are able to move on from that specific skill. But the main idea of this intervention is just small group and getting them some more practice outside of the big class. In terms of level 3, this is when a student has a z-score that falls between negative 1.96 and 0. But it also includes if this student showed a decline in their score from midterm to final. So let's take a look at an example. Let's look at student F. Student F had a midterm score of 75. As we can see here, this is lower than the midterm exam mean, which is 78.4. This student had a z-score for the midterm of negative 0.253, so we can see it lands in this range. If I look at the final score for student F, they received a final score of 73, which is lower than the final exam mean of 82.7. This student received a z-score of negative 0.724, which falls in this range as well. But if we notice here, they scored lower from their midterm to their final, so there was a decline there. So I would want to include some additional interventions so that way we don't continue to decline in our score, especially for the English standardized exam. Out of all of these students, I found that 2 would benefit from this additional intervention, so that is about 6.7% of the class. In terms of this intervention, I would do the same small group extra practice that I would do for level 2, but I would also include an additional step. Being that I don't want to include too much because this is not level 4, I would give the student a choice on whether or not they would like to join me for an individualized tutoring session, whether it be after school or during advisory, to receive one-on-one additional support, or if they would like me to give them some at-home practice. This would be an at-home practice online assignment that would give them immediate feedback. So I would let them choose between the two as a way to give them some additional support, but I would also give them that choice as well. Finally, I have level 4. This is when a student has a z-score that is less than negative 1.96. So remember, this is when a student receives a score that is statistically significantly less than the mean. So, for example, I would like to talk about student R. If you notice here with student R, they received a midterm score that is 62. As we can see here, this is less than the mean for the midterm exam. They had a z-score of negative 1.221. So at first you're like, but that's not less than negative 1.96. You're correct. But if we look at their final score, student R scored a 56, which is a lot less than that final exam mean. Student R's z-score for the final score was a negative 1.994. So we can see here that is less than negative 1.96, which again represents a statistically significant factor here. So I would place them in this level 4 category. After factoring out these things for all the students, I found that about 3 students out of the 30 students would benefit from this level 4 intervention. That is about 10% of the class. This is what it consists of. I would do the small group intervention, just like I did for level 2 and level 3, but I would also reach out to parents and communicate with them as a way to advocate that they join tutoring hours with me to get some more individual support. I offer tutoring after school and during advisory, so I would encourage those students to get some one-on-one support with me as a way to improve whatever English skill that they are lacking in. This would be very individualized. Again, I would look at the midterm and their final as a way to identify what skills that they could benefit more practice in. Finally, there is one student that I would recommend for special education here based off of my data, and this is student S. If we look, student S scored significantly low on both his midterm and his final exam. His midterm score was a 46, and his final score was a 55. The Z-score for the midterm was a negative 2.413, which was very low considering that the threshold is a negative 1.96. And we can see here on the final it was a negative 2.069. So we are still scoring statistically significantly lower than the average, both on the midterm and the final. So I do believe that some additional interventions outside of the classroom would benefit this specific student based off of the data that I found. I just want to thank you so much for watching my presentation, and please let me know if you have any questions. Bye-bye.